I remember the exact moment I realized something had to change. The air in my condo felt heavier than usual, thick with the unspoken, the assumptions, the entitlement that had slowly crept into my life. I had always believed that love meant giving until nothing remained of yourself, that being a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend, meant sacrificing every need, every desire, every piece of comfort to make room for others. But when I opened the door that Thursday afternoon and found Dion and Chloe standing there with suitcases in hand, a wave of disbelief hit me so hard it left me frozen for a moment. My chest tightened, my heart raced. This was not what I had expected. The silence that followed my words, telling them to leave, was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each tick marking a decision I knew would change everything. Dion froze, his hand still mid-air, his eyes searching mine for something, maybe comprehension, maybe permission, maybe forgiveness. And Chloe, she just let out a breathless sound that carried disbelief, confusion, and fear all at once. "What did you say?" Dion's voice cracked, higher than I had ever heard it, trembling with a mix of anger and incomprehension. I felt a pang of sadness because I knew what was coming, the fight, the guilt, the barrage of arguments dressed as concern. But deep inside, I also felt something I hadn't in decades. Clarity. This was my home, my space, my life. And for the first time in years I was choosing me. I remember squeezing the teacup in my hands that afternoon, the porcelain warm against my palms, as if it were the only anchor keeping me tethered to some sense of calm. "Ava," I whispered to myself, "don't make my mistake." The words my friend had shared with me years ago replayed in my mind with an almost haunting precision. Don't wait until it's too late. Say no when you need to. Protect your space. Choose yourself. And that day, I realized I had been waiting my whole life for permission that would never come. I had waited for the right moment, for the perfect circumstances, for the world to align with my dreams of peace and independence. But those moments, I now understood, only existed in my imagination. They never arrived. And so the choice was mine alone. I told them to leave. Not out of anger. Not out of malice. But because I had finally understood that living for everyone else had cost me my life. The messages on my phone started immediately after. Olivia worried. Dion angry. The calls, the texts, the subtle accusations wrapped in concern. It all flooded in like a storm. My first instinct was to defend myself, to explain, to make sure my voice was heard over the chorus of misunderstanding. But then I paused, listened to the quiet of my condo, the faint hum of the city outside my window, and felt something I hadn't expected. I didn't care as much as I thought I would. For the first time, I realized I didn't need everyone to understand. I didn't need anyone's permission. This was my life. My choice. My boundary. The following morning, sunlight streamed softly through my bedroom window, casting gentle patterns across the floor. For a moment, everything felt normal, peaceful even. But then reality returned, sharp and insistent, as I remembered the confrontation from the night before. I had asked my son to leave, and now his absence filled the house with an echo I wasn't used to. I went through my morning routine slowly, deliberately, washing my face, brushing my teeth, each motion grounding me to the present. The condo was quiet, the air filled with the familiar scent of coffee brewing. I poured myself a cup, the rich aroma wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. My gaze fell toward the guest room. Chloe's belongings were still neatly arranged on the bed, waiting. Dion's messages flickered on my phone. Olivia's worried inquiries, my cousin checking in, and Dion's practical note about picking up his things. Each message was a reminder of the tension, the rift, the consequences of my choice. And yet, beneath it all, I felt a strange relief, a quiet affirmation that I had finally taken ownership of my space and my life. When I called Olivia, it was not out of obligation but a desire for connection. I explained my side of the story carefully, recounting the months of unspoken sacrifice, The weight of never saying no, the exhaustion of living for others at the expense of myself. She listened, interjecting only with gentle clarifying questions, and I realized something profound. The people around me had simply assumed my availability, my willingness to give endlessly, without ever asking or considering the cost. I hadn't overreacted. I had acted to reclaim my life. By the time Dion arrived to collect his and Chloe's things, I was prepared, though my heart still pounded in anticipation. The doorbell rang and I took a deep breath, steadying myself before opening it. He stood there, bags slung over his shoulders, his expression carefully neutral. There was no malice, no warmth, just the weight of obligation. He moved past me silently, heading straight for the guest room. I stayed back, giving him space but kept the door within view. I listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing, the zipper of bags, the familiar creak of the bed frame as he gathered their belongings. Time slowed. Each sound reminded me of all the nights I had waited exhausted, ensuring everyone else's needs were met first. And now, for the first time in decades, it was just me. He emerged finally, bags in hand, pausing halfway to the door. I wondered if he would say something, an apology, a word of understanding, but he only nodded toward the hallway. "Can I use the restroom quickly before I leave?" he asked, voice neutral. "Of course," I replied. The sound of running water carried through the apartment, and in that moment, I understood the full weight of my action. I had created space, boundaries, and yet I had also created distance. A part of my son now felt like a stranger in the house where he had grown up. He came out, picked up his bags, and stopped at the threshold. His eyes met mine finally, and for the first time I saw hesitation there, as if he were questioning what this new relationship would look like. "Is there anything you want to say, Mom?" he asked quietly. I felt a flood of emotions, love, fear, hope, and sorrow. But what emerged from my lips was simple, firm, and true. "I love you, Dun. I will always love you. But I'm no longer going to sacrifice my well-being to avoid your discomfort." The door closed behind Dion with a soft click that echoed louder than I expected. I stood there for a few moments, hands trembling slightly, heart racing. Relief, sorrow, and a strange sense of empowerment swirled together inside me. I had done it. I had maintained my boundary, even when every maternal instinct screamed at me to run after him, apologize, and beg him to understand. And yet, in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: ownership of my own life. Over the next few days, the world seemed to slow down around me. My condo was quiet, my space entirely mine. Yet, the quiet carried a weight, the recognition that the relationship with my son had shifted. There was no longer the automatic ease of familiarity, but a new terrain, unfamiliar and fragile, that we both had to navigate. Calls from Olivia came intermittently, first worried, then reflective. She began to see the sacrifices I had made for her years ago, the invisible toll of hosting someone in need without ever expressing my own boundaries. It was a small acknowledgement, yet it was enough to remind me that my choices had value. I continued with my life, performing my routines with a deliberate mindfulness I hadn't practiced before. Coffee on the balcony, reading in the afternoon sunlight, walking slowly through the streets without obligation. Each act, small as it seemed, was an affirmation of my right to exist fully for myself. And slowly, week by week, I felt the tension inside me ease. The guilt that had gnawed at me began to fade, replaced by the calm certainty that I had done what was necessary, not only for myself but for the future of my relationship with my son. Weeks passed, each day carrying a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air between Dion and me. I no longer felt the constant pull of obligation, the invisible chains of unspoken expectations. And yet the ache of our strained connection lingered, a quiet reminder that love sometimes required courage, not just kindness. Then one morning a small thread of communication arrived. A simple text from Dion. Not an apology, not a deep conversation. Just a photo of him and Chloe in their newly renovated condo. "We're back home," it said. That was all. A thin thread, fragile, but it was there. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my chest tightening with a mixture of hope and sorrow. It wasn't the reconciliation I had imagined, but it was something. Proof that life, even after a rupture, could continue. I responded simply, carefully. "I'm glad you're comfortable in your space now. Take care." No grand speeches, no insistence on explanation. Just acknowledgement, a recognition of boundaries respected and space given. The days stretched into weeks and slowly, Dion's presence in my life shifted from intrusion to choice. I could see him in small ways, in calls, in messages, in the occasional invitation for coffee. He was learning, as was I, that love was not merely doing for each other, but listening, respecting, and honoring what each of us truly needed. And through this slow evolution, I began to notice a profound change within myself. The guilt, the self-doubt, the endless questioning of whether I was a good mother began to dissolve. In its place emerged a rare, quiet pride. A pride not in perfection, not in sacrifice, but in having found the courage to say no, to reclaim my voice, and to begin teaching my son the value of respect, honesty, and mutual understanding. One Saturday, a call from Dion came through. My heart skipped a beat when I saw his name flash on the screen. I could feel the nervous anticipation coiling in my stomach, the same tension I had felt so many years ago in moments of uncertainty with him. "Hello, Mom," he said, and his voice carried a tentative warmth I hadn't heard in weeks. I answered, "Hi, Dion. How are you?" There was a pause, and then he spoke, carefully choosing his words. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you said, and I realized something important. I've never really asked what you need, Mom. I've never considered that your life isn't just about me, or for me. And that has to change." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, warmth flooding my chest as I listened. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not just as a mother, not just as someone who always said yes, but as a person with my own needs, my own life. The relief was overwhelming. I let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing both of us to breathe in the gravity of this revelation. "Thank you, Dion," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It means everything to hear that." He hesitated, then added, "Mom, I was wondering, could we have lunch? Just you and me. No Chloe, no pressure, just us talking." I felt a smile spread across my face, unexpected but welcome, as tears slid freely down my cheeks. "I'd love that," I replied, my heart lighter than it had been in years. That simple agreement, that willingness to meet halfway, felt like the start of something entirely new. Something honest. Something real. Something that could finally, slowly, heal the wounds time had created. Saturday arrived, and I felt a nervous flutter I hadn't experienced in years. I changed outfits 3 times, trying to find the right balance between comfort and dignity. Finally settling on a simple brown dress that felt like an extension of myself. Soft, familiar, and reassuring. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, my hands slightly trembling as I smoothed the folds of my dress and took a deep breath. The city buzzed around me, oblivious to the quiet storm of anticipation inside. Then I saw him, Dion, walking toward the table. Something had shifted in his posture, in the careful way he moved. There was humility there, a tentative respect, and for a moment my chest tightened at the vulnerability of it all. He sat across from me, and we exchanged a small, almost shy greeting. "Hi, Mom," he said, and I replied, "Hi, son." Our initial conversation was awkward, punctuated by long silences and hesitant words, but slowly, layer by layer, the walls we had built over decades began to crumble. He spoke about work, about Chloe, about mundane details, but it was in the pauses, the little confessions, the moments where he let his guard down, that I realized the depth of what was happening. Finally, between the main course and dessert, he stopped, looking me squarely in the eyes. "Mom, I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen without interrupting." My stomach tightened with anticipation. I nodded, silently urging him to continue, and what he said next struck me to my core. He admitted the truth I had longed to hear for years, that he had never really seen me beyond my role as his mother, that his expectations had been selfish, and that he was finally ready to change. The tears I had held back for so long came freely now, and I let them fall, each one carrying the weight of years of misunderstandings, resentment, and unspoken love. As the tears rolled down my cheeks, I realized something profound. This moment wasn't just about him admitting his faults. It was about both of us stepping into a new way of relating. Dion spoke with an honesty I hadn't heard in years, a voice trembling with vulnerability. "I don't need you to be the perfect mother," he said. "I need the real you, Mom. The one who has thoughts, needs, and boundaries." My heart ached with relief and joy all at once. For so long, I had hidden behind the mask of unconditional availability, believing that love meant sacrificing myself entirely. And for decades, that had been the measure of my worth, the standard by which I judged myself. But now, sitting there across from my son, I understood that love didn't demand invisibility. It required honesty. It required courage to show oneself fully, even when it scared you. We talked for hours, really talked. Not the polite small talk of family gatherings, not the careful words meant to avoid conflict, but the raw and perfect truth of two people trying to reconnect. He shared regrets, memories, moments he wished he had approached differently, and I shared mine, the silent disappointments, the compromises, and the years of quiet surrender. Each word was heavy yet liberating. I could feel the tension in our years of unspoken expectations slowly dissolving, replaced by a fragile but real hope. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, not just as a mother, but as a woman, a person with her own life, her own needs, and her own voice. And in that fragile hope, I found the courage to believe that our relationship could grow anew, rooted in mutual respect rather than habitual sacrifice. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. I quickly learned that healing is never linear. Dion would sometimes slip back into old patterns, assuming I would always be there, that my boundaries were negotiable. Each time a small ache hit my chest, a reminder that growth is a process, not an instant fix. But now I had a voice, a line I would not cross. I realized that teaching respect to your children doesn't end when they grow up. Sometimes the most important lessons come when they are fully grown, when they have their own lives and own responsibilities, yet still attempt to lean on you as if your existence were theirs to command. I learned to sit with discomfort without immediately dissolving it with compliance. I learned that relief, when paired with pain, could coexist. And slowly I began to notice something beautiful. A sense of peace replacing the constant guilt I had carried for decades. There were no grand declarations or dramatic apologies from Dion, just small, quiet acknowledgments of my boundaries. A text here, a considerate message there. And though it felt fragile at first, I cherished each one like a tiny lifeline connecting us to a more honest relationship. I found myself looking forward to these moments not with anxiety, but with a quiet anticipation. For the first time, I understood that love didn't have to demand erasure of the self. It could be protective, nurturing, and respectful all at once. And in that understanding, I discovered a strength I had forgotten I possessed. A strength not in doing for others endlessly, but in honoring myself, my needs, and my right to a life fully my own. I began to notice how much space I had reclaimed, not just physically in my condo, but emotionally and mentally. Mornings were mine again. The coffee I made wasn't just a ritual, it was a small declaration. This is my time, my choice. I started reading books I had set aside for years, letting myself linger over paragraphs and sentences without feeling guilty for taking hours for something that wasn't a necessity. I wandered through my neighborhood with no agenda, simply observing the world, noticing details I had overlooked for decades. The way sunlight glinted off the windows across the street, the laughter of children running down the sidewalk, the subtle rhythm of life continuing beyond my worries and obligations. And with each small act, I felt layers of old worn-out expectations peeling away. The weight of what I had carried for so long, the need to be everything to everyone, was lifting. I wasn't abandoning my family. I was finally recognizing that I had spent too long abandoning myself. The guilt that had once accompanied every pause for self-care began to dissolve. I allowed myself to rest in the knowledge that I was teaching a different kind of lesson now. That love can coexist with boundaries, that generosity is not measured by exhaustion, and that respect is a gift to be given and received. Even Dion's silence became less painful over time, replaced by anticipation for the next interaction, however small, that would reflect our new understanding. I understood that the changes in our relationship would be gradual, uneven, and sometimes uncomfortable, but they would be real, honest, and mutual. And there was a profound relief in that honesty, a relief I hadn't felt in decades. Weeks passed, and with them, I started noticing subtle shifts in Dion's demeanor. He no longer assumed I would always be available at a moment's notice. He began asking instead of telling, consulting instead of assuming. The tension that had hung between us like a heavy curtain seemed to lift slightly with each conversation that included mutual respect. One evening he called me unexpectedly, not about logistics, not about needs, but just to talk. I remember feeling my chest tighten in anticipation, wary of old patterns creeping in, yet curious to see what this new form of connection might bring. We spoke for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in reflective pauses that didn't need to be filled. He asked me about my day, my thoughts, my small joys and disappointments, genuinely wanting to know. And for the first time in decades, I felt seen, not just as a mother, not just as someone who had carried him and cared for him, but as Ava Holloway, a woman with her own life, her own voice, and her own right to boundaries. It was a fragile, delicate thing, this new rhythm we were building, but it was real. And in that reality I found hope, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic, but quiet, steady, and persistent. I realized that relationships, even the most intimate ones, don't have to be sacrifices of self. They can be partnerships of respect, empathy, and honesty. And that understanding, once almost unimaginable, now felt like the most natural, most essential part of life. I began to notice changes in myself too. The constant anxiety, the underlying tension I had carried for decades, started to ease. My condo felt lighter, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing with me. Mornings became moments I could truly claim for myself. Sipping coffee slowly, watching the sunlight spill across the floor, listening to the city awaken. I no longer felt guilty for taking this time, for savoring these small joys. It was revolutionary in a way I hadn't anticipated. I could see now that the sacrifices I had made, though well-intentioned, had created an unspoken expectation around me, that I existed to serve, to absorb, to accommodate. And now, as I practiced saying no, as I reinforced my boundaries, I realized that love didn't diminish. It transformed. It became clearer, more honest, more sustainable. Dion noticed it too, even if he didn't always admit it. The conversations we had were evolving, layered with the unspoken acknowledgement that we were learning something new about each other. There were moments of friction, of awkward misunderstanding, but they no longer held the same weight of dread. We could confront them and move forward. I was no longer shrinking to fit the mold of what motherhood had demanded, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, I began to reclaim parts of myself I hadn't seen in years. The woman who loved to write in the mornings, who lingered over music that stirred her soul, who laughed at her own private jokes. The more I embraced these moments, the more I saw that life wasn't just happening around me. It was mine to live fully. One evening I found myself sitting on the balcony, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of traffic and distant laughter. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet satisfaction in my own presence. I wasn't waiting for anyone to approve my choices. I wasn't shrinking to meet someone else's expectations. I was here fully in this exact moment, and it was enough. My phone buzzed intermittently with messages from friends, family, reminders of daily life, yet none of them felt intrusive. I could respond when I wanted, I could ignore when I needed. And in that freedom I discovered a deep, unexpected sense of peace. It wasn't loud or celebratory. It was subtle, patient, steady. I realized that this peace had been waiting for me all along, hidden beneath years of self-sacrifice, under layers of guilt and obligation. I had to strip away the expectation that my value was tied to the happiness of others, to the comfort I provided, to the availability I offered. And when I finally did, I could breathe. That evening, as I sipped a cup of chamomile tea and watched the sky darken into deep indigo, I allowed myself to acknowledge the full weight of what had happened with Dion. The rupture, the tension, the awkwardness, it all existed. And yet it no longer frightened me. I had faced it. I had set boundaries. I had chosen myself. And in that choice I found a new beginning, one that promised authenticity, honesty, and perhaps, over time, reconciliation. The following morning I woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds, painting golden stripes across my bedroom floor. I lingered in bed for a few moments, savoring the warmth, listening to the quiet hum of the city waking up. Even though the world moved on with its usual urgency, I felt detached in the most comforting way. There was no pressure, no invisible weight pressing down on me. I made coffee, letting the aroma fill the kitchen, grounding me in the simplicity of the moment. As I sipped my drink, I reflected on Dion's words from our lunch weeks ago. They echoed in my mind. "I've never asked you what you need." That simple admission carried so much power. It wasn't about blame or guilt. It was recognition. And recognition was the first step toward change. For years, I had carried the unspoken burden of being everything to everyone, thinking that love required endless giving. But now, I understood that love could also mean saying no, creating space, insisting on respect, and preserving my own humanity. I began to plan small things for myself. An afternoon at the art gallery I had always wanted to visit, a long walk without interruption, a weekend retreat to just be alone with my thoughts. These weren't selfish indulgences, they were acts of preservation, acts of cultivating a life that belonged to me. And in that cultivation I felt something stirring inside me, a quiet strength, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. My life was no longer a series of obligations. It was a canvas, blank in many ways, ready for the colors I chose to paint on it. In the weeks that followed, the apartment felt different. It wasn't just cleaner or quieter. It was lighter, infused with the sense of ownership I had reclaimed. Each morning I moved through my routine with a deliberate mindfulness, noticing details I had long ignored. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the way sunlight spilled across the countertop, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. I realized how much of my energy had been spent managing others' expectations, smoothing over discomforts, accommodating needs that were never mine to carry. Now, I spent that energy on myself, not selfishly but responsibly. One evening, as I sat by the window with my mug in hand, I found myself thinking about Dion. Our conversations, though infrequent, had begun to carry a new weight. There was honesty now, a careful acknowledgement that boundaries could coexist with love. He wasn't fully healed, nor was I, but there was progress, fragile and beautiful. I allowed myself a small, private smile. It was proof that change was possible, that relationships could evolve beyond old patterns, that respect could replace obligation. And in that moment I understood something profound. the path to being seen, truly seen, began with seeing oneself. Until I honored my own limits, until I recognized my own needs as valid, I could never expect anyone else to fully recognize them. That realization brought a strange mix of grief and relief. A mourning for the years spent invisible, and gratitude for the courage it had taken to finally step into visibility. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I was the curator of my existence, responsible for its shape, its tone, its boundaries. And for the first time in decades, that responsibility felt like freedom. One afternoon, as the city's rhythm pulsed beyond my window, I found myself reflecting on the subtle transformations in my life. Even the small things carried significance. The way I could linger over a book without interruption, the calm that settled over me when I sipped tea alone, the unhurried moments where I simply existed. I realized that my happiness was no longer contingent on others' approval or comfort. The quiet triumph of reclaiming my own space had created a foundation I hadn't known I needed. And yet, the changes weren't just internal. Dion's messages, sparse but deliberate, carried a tone of respect I had never felt before. Each carefully chosen word was an acknowledgement of my boundaries, a tentative step toward a new dynamic. I understood finally that teaching respect was ongoing, that it wasn't a one-time declaration but a living, evolving practice. It required patience, consistency, and sometimes the courage to endure discomfort, both for me and for the ones I loved. And I did endure it. I endured the moments of guilt, the quiet ache of separation, the questions that lingered. Was I too harsh? Would he ever forgive fully? Could love survive the friction of necessary boundaries? And slowly, I saw that love wasn't diminished by honesty. It was strengthened. By protecting my own space, I had allowed the space for authentic connection, the kind that didn't demand sacrifice at the altar of convenience. In the soft light of evening, I understood that the hardest part had been the first step, saying no. Everything else, the healing, the respect, the possibility of a renewed relationship, was only possible because I had claimed that first act of courage. And in that realization, I felt the quiet power of a life finally owned, a story finally told on my own terms. Days blended into weeks, and life settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in decades. There was a serenity in knowing that my home, my sanctuary, was truly mine. A place where my thoughts, my desires, my presence mattered first. I began to notice the small joys I had long overlooked. The way sunlight streamed across my kitchen floor in the mornings, the soft hum of traffic that felt like the heartbeat of the city, the laughter of children in the distance that reminded me of life's continuity. Dion continued to reach out, sometimes with simple messages, sometimes with thoughtful conversations, and each interaction carried a subtle evolution. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. I learned that growth, both mine and his, was rarely linear. There were moments of tension, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, when the comfort of taking without asking tested the new boundaries. And yet, every time I held firm, I reminded myself that love without boundaries was no longer the love I wanted to live by. I would not let my existence be reduced to service alone, no matter the cost of temporary hurt or anger. It was a delicate balance, maintaining connection while asserting my own needs. And slowly, that balance began to feel less precarious. I felt gratitude, not just for the lessons I had learned, but for the opportunity to model for my son a form of love that was both fierce and tender, firm yet compassionate. Each day I felt a deeper sense of integrity, the kind that comes from living authentically, without compromise of one's own values. And in that integrity, I discovered a freedom I hadn't realized I'd been craving my entire life. The freedom to be myself, unapologetically, wholly, and without fear. It was during one of those quiet evenings, sitting in my armchair with the city lights flickering outside my window, that I truly reflected on how far I had come. I thought about the younger Ava, the The woman who spent decades bending her life around the needs of others, who measured her worth by how much she could give, who carried guilt like a second skin. And now I felt a profound contrast. I could feel my own heartbeat, steady and calm, without the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined so many years. I allowed myself to remember my mother, my grandmother, and the unspoken rules that had shaped our lives. That women must give, sacrifice, and endure without question. Those rules had been inherited, passed down like fragile glass, beautiful in theory but dangerous in practice. I had lived by them so faithfully that I had nearly forgotten what it meant to live for myself. But now I had broken the cycle, not with anger or rebellion, but with courage, with patience, with deliberate choices. Dion was learning, too, slowly letting go of the assumption that my love was limitless and unconditional in ways that demanded no respect. It wasn't easy, and sometimes the silence between us felt heavier than words. But the moments of connection were real, and they were stronger for having been hard-won. I realized then that boundaries weren't walls. They were bridges that taught others how to truly meet me, fully and honestly. I felt a warmth settle in my chest, a quiet pride that wasn't about validation from anyone else, but about knowing deep down that I had chosen myself, that I had learned finally that self-respect was the cornerstone of love, that I could give without vanishing, that I could love without losing myself. That Thursday afternoon when I found the suitcases at my entrance was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter where love and respect coexisted, where honesty replaced obligation, and where I finally understood what it meant to be fully alive in my own life. I sit now in my favorite armchair, coffee in hand, feeling the sun cast golden patterns across my quiet condo. Every object, every corner, feels like a testament to the life I've chosen for myself. A life where my needs matter, where my voice is heard, and where my heart remains open without being depleted. Dion and I continue to navigate our relationship carefully, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, always learning. But the difference now is profound. He sees me as a person, not just as his mother, and I see him not as a child who takes, but as an adult who can love with respect. The lessons I've learned are not theoretical. They are etched into every decision I make, every boundary I set, every moment I choose to honor myself. Life will continue to test me, as it always does, but I am no longer afraid of saying no, of asserting my space, of insisting on respect. And if there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this: love yourself fiercely. Protect your time, your energy, your heart. Set boundaries not as acts of cruelty, but as declarations of worth. Because the day you choose yourself without apology, the day you stop bending to the weight of expectations, that day you will truly begin to live. And when you do, the people who belong in your life will rise to meet you, not to take from you, but to walk beside you. So breathe, reflect, and know that it's never too late to reclaim your life. Love deeply, live honestly, and never, ever forget your worth.